Hello and welcome to my top 15 extinct American steam locomotives list. Number 15, the Union Pacific Early Challengers. These 4664s were what the other railroads thought that bought this type of locomotive thought was going to be the ultimate steam locomotive. In 1926, the first ever 412-2 type locomotive was built, known as the UP, aka Union Pacific class. But the problem was they couldn't handle the tight curves in Wyoming and Utah. But in 1936, after a lot of research and development, the first 4664 in America at least was produced. Known as the Early Challengers, or CSAs, they were used in heavy freight trains in Wyoming and Utah to pick up the slack through the mountains. Sadly, they were all retired and scrapped by 1959. Number 14. The Baltimore Ohio T3B/T3C. The B&O T3s were built from 1942 to 1948 and used boilers from retired 282s and 462s. They were used for mixed traffic, freight and passenger, and served the B&O all the way up until 1960 when they were sadly cut up for scrap. Number 13. The Milwaukee Road Baltic 464s. The F6 Baltics were built between 1929 and 1931. They were used for fast passenger service between Chicago, Illinois, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. They served the Milwaukee Road for a little over 3 decades until all of them were retired by 1954 and scrapped within a few years. Well, at least we got Mike Kidbash to keep the legend alive. And of course, the Weaver models. Number 12. Southern Pacific AC9s. These two 884 partially streamlined articulators were built in 1939 by Lima Locomotive Works and were used in Southern Pacific's southern portion of the system between New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. Only 12 of these were ever built, but were surprisingly powerful at 123,364 pounds of tractive effort. Unfortunately, after dieselization came along, and after the last stand on this team on the Modoc line, all the AC9s were gone between 1957 and 1960. Number 11. The Eerie L1 0880s. The three underrated Camelback Malays were built in 1907. They were nicknamed the Angus type, named after Angus Sinclair, who was the publisher of the Eerie Railway and locomotive engineer. But in 1921, the three Angus types were rebuilt into 2882s with more conveniently placed cabs, aka the rear of the locomotive rather than the middle. But this was not enough to save them from being retired in 1930 and scrapped within a few years later. Number 10. The New York Central Niagaras and A2 Berkshires. I'm going to go through the Niagaras first, then go on to the Berks. After World War II, the New York Central ordered their own set of 484s, Niagaras, which were named after the Niagara River and Falls, and lasted until the mid-1950s. Now with the A2s, they were built in 1948 for freight service, originally for the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, but then ran under the New York Central System banner until they were retired and scrapped by 1957. Number 9. The Norfolk Western Y6B. Before I start blabbing about this class, I would like to mention 2156 is a Y6A, not a Y6B. Makes sense? Okay, let's go over the history. From 1948 to 1952, 38 2882s, known as the Y6Bs, were built and ran coal trains through the NNW system, but all of them except one were retired and scrapped by 1960. Number 2174, on the other hand, almost made it into preservation. After being used on a farewell to steam excursion in 1959, it was sold to a scrapyard in Roanoke until it was unfortunately scrapped in 1978 after one final attempt to save the locomotive. Number 8. The New York Central Dreyfuss J3A Hudsons. I'm getting confused with myself now. 50 of these were built by Alco for the New York Central from 1937 to 1938, and 10 of them were fitted with the famous Henry Dreyfuss streamlining for the famous 20th Century Limited. Then some more were streamlined for the Empire State Express. But after diesels took over the high priority assignments, they were all retired and scrapped throughout the 1950s. Number 7. The New Haven I-5 464s. These 464s were the most famous engines on the New Haven Railroad, with the streamlining designed by Otto Cooler, the Pullman Merchants Limited, and the Yankee Clipper. They were certainly the thoroughbred of the one of the thoroughbreds of the Hudson class. Unfortunately, after World War II, the New Haven began purchasing diesels, and the I-5s were sadly cut up throughout the 1950s. Number 6. The Baltimore Ohio Em1s. After World War II, the B&O ordered 30 2884s to handle heavy freight traffic through the late 1940s and through the early to mid 1950s. And because of the roller bearing rods, they were able to handle fast mail and express trains as well. And they did on occasion. But in 1957, all of them were gone. Number 5. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 210-2s. In the 1910s, the Santa Fe built 10 210-2s after the success of the 2662 Prairie articulated locomotives, which some of them had jointed boilers. But sadly enough, they were deemed unsuccessful due to the undersized boiler and poor operation. So they only worked for the Santa Fe until they were deemed unsuccessful in the late 19 teens and were cut into two separate twos each. The Boston to Maine, Southern Pacific, and Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 284s. The Boston to Maine ordered 25 284s known as the T1As and T1Bs. They had what were called coffin feed water heaters, which gave them a distinct appearance. I always thought it looked like a bonnet for some reason. And it looked like unlike any other steam locomotive out there. But after World War II, after rear trailing truck issues, the Boston and Maine sold 10 of their own Berks to the Southern Pacific, and 7 more were sold to the Santa Fe. The last 8 served the Boston and Maine until 1946, and by 1955, all of them were gone. Number 3. The Pennsylvania Railroad T1 4444s. These shark-nosed giants were built in 1941 by Baldwin for the Pennsy and were the next generation of passenger steam locomotives. They pulled a variety of different passenger trains, most notably the PRR's flagship train, the Broadway Limited. But after diesels came around to take over those assignments, the T1s were downgraded for doing fast mail and express trains. And during the 1950s, the once proud shark-nosed steamers, were sadly retired and scrapped. Number 2. The Pennsylvania Railroad N1 Class 210-2s. These were the underrated oddballs of the Pennsy roster, in my opinion. 35 of these 210-2s were built by Alco, and 25 more were built by Baldwin around the same time, between 1918 and 1919. which were used for very heavy freight service all the way up until 1950. And all of them have been retired and scrapped, sadly enough. And I want to go over number one, but before we do, I would like to give some honorable mentions to this list. Number one, the Pennsylvania Railroad Q2 4464s. The true, you should have seen this one coming. The true thoroughbreds of the Pennsylvania Railroad's steam locomotive roster, at least in my opinion. In 1944, the first Q2 duplex locomotive, number 6131, was built, and after seeing how successful it was, they built an additional 25 Q2s to haul heavy freight trains. They were considered the most powerful steam locomotive on the planet in terms of horsepower. It had 7,987 horsepower, as well as 100,816 pounds of tractive effort. 115,816 pounds with the booster engaged. But unfortunately, as most of us probably already know, these beautiful steam giants were withdrawn from service in 1951 and sent to the scrapyard. Well, I hope you all have enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. And if you want me to do a top 10 retired steam excursion stars video, let's try and get to at least 10 likes, maybe 8. Let's just go for 8 likes. And comment which locomotive you would have liked to see on this list. Bye.